right, everybody. Well, I want to welcome you back to another episode of Creation and Compost. This is episode number 8, and this is by far one of my most, what's the best way I could say it? Probably one of the most exciting interviews that I have had planned, and thankfully, this gentleman has decided to spend his afternoon with us. I've got Mr. Dan Love with us today as our guest, and I just want to welcome you, Dan. I appreciate you being on our podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's a privilege to be here.
Thank you very much, too. And I just want to, first off, before you get into some of your background, one thing that I wanted everybody to know is you are what I consider one of our heroes, as you have served for many years in the military. And I first and foremost want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Of course, you can share anything that you'd like to as we get into talking about what it is you do on a daily basis and how that service has prepared you for what you're doing now. But I just wanted to, right off the get-go, our veterans, our first responders, they just don't get told that enough. And I just wanted you to know sincerely that you are definitely a hero, and your sweet wife, who also works here with us, she is also a hero as well for the support that I know that it would have taken to get through all that. So anyways, you guys are you're such an encouragement. So I guess what I'd like to start off with is, since I kind of wanted to take this away from the science subject, and we've recently talked about end times prophecy, we've talked about pro-life, and we've even brought in a coach who was talking about the work he did with FCA, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I thought it'd be really cool to bring someone who not only has served in the military, but has such a passion for teaching social studies. So I just wanted you to just share a little bit of your background, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, so originally from Texas, but my parents were missionaries to Colombia, South America. And that time overseas greatly shaped me. And being in a country that, Colombia in the 1990s was the height of the drug war. So names like Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, it was a dangerous place to live, but it's a place that needs the gospel. Right. It's a place that needs to know about that the violence that they're experiencing and the bloodshed and all that there is hurt and pain in that country, and they need hope. So that's the environment that I grew up in. And so I think from very early on, I developed a sense of a sensitivity to justice and injustice, and seeing evil. It just frankly, it ticked me off. You know what I mean? Like just the pain and the suffering that the people of Colombia endured was something that always stuck with me. And I felt like there should be something more that's done. Why is it that people are standing by and letting evil win? So there was one time where our family had to evacuate the country because assassins came looking for my dad. And so the drug cartel would try to kidnap Americans and hold them for ransom. And so it was a dangerous place to be. And so that had a formative time in my life. And so after leaving Columbia, I came to Liberty University. And while I was at LU, 9/11 happened. And so with the September 11th terror attacks taking place, that was the moment where I realized that I wanted to go into the military, that our country was under attack, that somebody needed to do something. And the horror and the pain and the suffering that I saw in Colombia, that's not, I didn't want to see that happen here at home. And now, being old enough, being able to do something, I decided to enlist in the military. And so after I finished up college, I got a job teaching here at LCA. And basically the part that I skipped over is that I tried to get into the military and I failed the military physical. So there's a balance test. I couldn't walk like a duck. I fell over and failed. And so my aspirations to get into the military came to an end at that moment. But it always stuck with me. Like, I knew that if I didn't try again, that I would regret it. And so I graduated from LU, got my job teaching at LCA, started practicing walking like a duck, for real, and went back to the military physical and passed. And so that was in 2009, and enlisted for the next 6 years. And shortly after basic training, I reported to my units, and they told us that we were deploying to Iraq. And so in 2010, served about about an 8-month, 9-month deployment overseas. And so came back to teaching. And so that's my story in a nutshell over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I had no idea that you had spent that time in Colombia. I had no clue. So
yeah, I used to be fluent in Spanish. I've lost a lot of it, unfortunately, but it was a powerful time in my life to experience seeing my parents serve on the mission field, and I'm thinking about how my siblings, I have one brother and 3 sisters, and I think about the careers that they've chosen. I have 2 siblings that are in the FBI, and the other 2 are nurses. And so very much justice type careers, service type careers. And so it's not just that experience didn't just shape me. It certainly had an impact on my siblings as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people do not consider is when you grow up, like I grew up in South Georgia and I spent my entire life there. Like I lived in the same house from when I was 9 months old until I was 18 or 17 and a half, whatever. And, I had this sense of comfort and this sense of such simplicity that when I meet someone like you who grew up in another country, a place much different than the U.S., it's a completely different perspective. And the fact that, like you said, it not only shaped you, it shaped your entire family. Your siblings and everyone else have this sense of justice that you feel like needs to be served, needs to be enacted. And, nursing and definitely the FBI are both, they're both, professions that also include that sacrifice. And they're definitely heroes as well. And I'm not just saying that because my wife is a nurse, but it's definitely a frontline type job. So, so I guess a question before we jump into some specifics is, did you always want to go into teaching? Was that something that you had in the back of your mind? I know you were talking about wanting to be in some kind of line of work where justice, you had a sense of active participation. But was teaching something that you had thought about when you were younger?
Yeah, in 7th grade, I had a history teacher that made history come to life. He turned it into a story. And I just remember at that point that I knew that that's what I wanted to do with my life, that I wanted to be a history teacher and do what this teacher is doing. I want to be able to make history come to life for students, to show the past as a powerful story, a story that has the power to transform, and also at the same time using history as a vehicle to be able to present truth, to tell the greatest story ever told, the story of the gospel, the life of Christ. And the effect that a powerful narrative has on the heart and mind is noticeable. Like, people's lives are transformed by the powerful stories that they hear. And so I just wanted to be able to be that vehicle, to be used by God, to be able to bring history to life and to be able to share what God has done in history with my students, and to show them that it's not just a series of dry dates and boring events, right? But this is the hand of God at work in our past, right? That history has a point. There's a destination. It's not an endless cycle, that it's linear, that it's all going to a certain place, to a certain point, right? It's culminating with the return of Christ. And that is the hope that we're waiting for, that one day, every knee will bow and every tongue confess, but you know what? Like, also every tear will be dry. You know what I mean? Yeah. That all that is wrong will be made right. And so history, I think, can have a powerful effect on somebody's life. And so I wanted to be able to participate in that.
Yeah. Well, and social studies was always my favorite subject. I actually, as a science teacher of 17 years, I did not enjoy science as much as I did social studies. And it was because I had 2 or 3 really, really, when I say amazing, it doesn't even do justification, but like you said, they were such good storytellers, and they had different approaches in the way they did it. One used life experiences, and the other one he just never cracked his book open, but he could make the stories come to life without in it. And I think the authenticity of the fact that he knew his stuff and he didn't have to crack a book, I think is what really did it for me.
Yeah.
Are there like specific subjects? And, I know you do the military history course. What are some other things that you're currently teaching right now that you've been teaching?
Yeah, the two classes that I teach are first military history, that's elective for our juniors and seniors. And the primary course that I teach is world history 2. So that's basically the story of the world from the Renaissance and Reformation to modern times.
Yeah. And that for me, I think probably my favorite time period ever learning about was the American Revolution. That was just always something I was fascinated by, because I get to thinking about people like, George Washington having pretty much like the best, I don't even want to call it a pickup team, but the best team of Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and just he had such a dynamic team and was such a gifted leader. And of course, I digress, but that's my favorite time period, I guess. But what are some of your like favorite topics or parts of the content that you teach?
Yeah, so it's hard to narrow it down by time period. Topics, absolutely, but it's hard. I love many different time periods in history, from the Reformation, the story of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door, to World War II, the Cold War, and the modern era. It's hard to nail down one specific time period, but I think the topic that I'm passionate about is wanting to show my students how their faith plays a role in history and everything that they do, right? That the hand of God is present in history. That when they walk out of my class, their faith is strengthened as much as they are walking out of Bible class or out of chapel, right? Because I think what I try to teach my students is that in our Western culture, we have fallen into a trap. There's a way of thinking that we've embraced that it runs contrary to scripture. And I think we don't even realize that we think in this way. And C.S. Lewis once said that the most powerful, like the most dangerous ideas are the ones not being discussed. It's the ideas that are just assumed, right? Things that we just absorb from our fallen culture and we don't realize it. And it's this, we in the West, and I think it's a result of like the Enlightenment and scientific revolution and a host of other events, but basically we split reality, right, into the upper floor and lower floor. Okay, so like we have our daily life, we have school and sports and politics and technology, and then we divide that with like faith and church and prayer and Bible class. So there's kind of like a secular part of our life and a spiritual part of our life. And there's a big wall that separates the two. So if I'm a student, I'm going to Bible class, my spiritual switch turns on. I expect to hear spiritual truth. As soon as I go into science class, though, my spiritual switch turns off and I expect to not hear spiritual truth, right? I'm here just to hear science. And that's a false idea. That's an idea that runs contrary to scripture. Like all truth is God's truth. Francis Schaeffer put it this way. Francis Schaeffer said that that Christianity is not it's not just spiritual truth. It's not a story of just spiritual truth. It's truth for total reality, right? If God is the author of all things, then all things belong to him. Right. So I think one of the goals is I want to be able to destroy that spiritual switch, the on-off switch. I want to erase that division, right? I want to show that a student's faith, their Christian worldview, applies to Bible class as much as it applies to history class, as much as it applies to science class. Because here's the danger if we continue down this road of separating our spiritual life from our daily life. I think what happens is that as time goes on, especially for our students, they start asking, how is my faith relevant to what I do on a daily basis, right? I go to church 1 hour Sunday morning, but the rest of the week at school and at work, my faith has no impact upon my life. So I think that's why maybe we see so many students trying to walk away from the faith, that by the time they graduate from college, they're asking the question, my faith isn't relevant to my daily life anymore. And that's because we've fallen into that false way of thinking of dividing the sacred from the secular, right? The physical from the spiritual. And we've gotten really good at that, flipping that spiritual switch on and off, but it's led us to a point where we believe that our Christian worldview actually has no impact on our daily life. And that's a lie that the enemy wants us to embrace. So I want to challenge those ideas. Like, those are ideas that, like, many people don't think about. And, you know, our students don't see that intellectual trap that they have fallen into, that we've just absorbed from our culture. And it can be hard because as a teacher, we can fall into that trap. You know, I'm the department chair here at LCA, and I help to hire new history teachers, and I help with the training of that. And oftentimes I'll ask in an interview, how would you incorporate your Christian worldview into your teaching? And a lot of answers fall into the trap that I just talked about. And I think people think that, okay, we'll provide a verse for our students, and that's great. Or we'll pray at the start of class. That's great. Okay, it's good to pray. We can point to a verse that our content might relate to. But the problem is that it's not showing how our content actually relates to spiritual truth. Okay. And so when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, and we talk about millions of Africans being captured and sold into slavery and placed into bondage, why is that evil, right? Isn't that something that everyone already assumes correctly, that that is a horrific, evil event? I want to challenge my students to ask the question, why? What worldview best explains why that is evil? Why was it evil for the Germans to put the Jews in gas chambers? Why was the Holocaust evil? We're making moral judgments. What worldview best explains why those actions are wrong? And what I want to challenge my students to see is that Christianity provides the moral framework for us to be able to make those moral evaluations. That if there is a moral law, there is a moral lawgiver. And that moral lawgiver can only be God. But if we say God doesn't exist, then there's not a moral lawgiver. And if there's not a moral lawgiver, there's not a moral law. So there's not right and wrong. It's just survival of the fittest. So if there's no right and wrong, explain how a worldview like atheism can condemn the Holocaust or the Atlantic slave trade as evil. Isn't it just one civilization a powerful civilization preying upon the weak? So I want to challenge my students to think about their assumptions. We always assume that these events are good or they're evil. Why? What worldview best explains why we can make those moral assumptions? So that's just the not the quick answer. I was going to say the quick answer to your question, but I want my students to be able to see that everything that they do in life, including the study of history, needs to be grounded in a Christian worldview.
Well, and that pretty much answered my next question. What's funny about it is you mentioned it's not the quick answer. For the previous podcast we've had, there are no quick answers with the people that we've had on. And the reason being is because I really, when I was praying about doing this, I was asking, just making a list. I made a list of about 25 or 30 people that I really just wanted to sit down and talk to. And you were definitely one of those, because I knew just from the time, some of the stuff you just shared at our orientation this year, you shared some of that in your introduction on the CFR, the creation, fall, redemption, that, we're supposed to embrace and teach every day. And I wasn't really sure, even after going through the training, of how to do that in a way where, I knew from a scientific perspective, I'm obviously, I'm a creationist. I classify myself more in the young earth creationist camp. I definitely believe the Bible teaches that. I believe it's something that can be easily defended. But I also try to bring my, I guess, I don't want to say skeptical public school background. I don't want to just feel like I'm force feeding my students everything. I do try to ask more questions. I do try to, instead of leading them, I do want them to try to think. And for science, and I know even for social studies, sometimes just trying to get them motivated and trying to break that mold that, we're just going in circles. Like you mentioned, it's actually a linear progression. We're going through the entire thing to show how God did it from the very beginning. So you kind of answered my question on what I was going to ask about how the Bible plays a role in understanding history. because of the fact that we do have a moral lawgiver who gives us that moral law. And I guess one of the things I'd like to ask about is, are there any conflicts? Well, you kind of answered this too. But, as far as that goes, are there specifics in terms of, aside from historical, like the Nazis, or, we think of Hitler and what he did to the Jews, are there like current issues that you'd feel comfortable addressing in terms of conflicts that people can be faced with when a biblical perspective is kind of taken out of the equation? Maybe some things that we either see in the news, or I don't know, just some other things that you maybe want to share on that.
Yeah, so everyone is going to embrace a worldview, right? And there's going to be worldviews that will be embraced, that will come up short in explaining what we're experiencing on a daily basis, right? So, I think about, talking about current events, we think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, okay? We think about why is it wrong for a stronger country to invade a smaller country? Why is the world outraged at what they're seeing? You know what I mean? Why do we sense that moral tension and that moral anger of seeing men, women, and children being killed in their own homes and in their own cities, right? It's a horrifying thing to see.
Yeah.
But we also understand like what worldview allows us to explain that moral tension. If it's just survival of the fittest, the problem with that worldview is it doesn't have a moral source to explain its moral claims, right? That the violence that we're seeing, there's no moral source in atheism that can explain why people are experiencing that outrage. So one of the reasons why Christianity is so powerful, and it's just not a religion of the heart, but it's also of the mind, that there is a strong intellectual tradition and history of the Christian faith of Christians trying to tackle some of the most difficult dilemmas and experiences that are out there, and there are answers. When we look at conflict like Russia invading Ukraine, we have the Christian just war theory. We have a just war framework that has been in place for 2,000 years. This isn't something that was just developed on YouTube yesterday. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like this has been in place for almost 2,000 years that explains when a war is just and when it's not, right? When is a war justified? Well, these boxes, these criteria need to be met, right? We talk about that in my class, my history class, when we study conflict. We look at the causes of the conflict and we plug it into the Christian just war theory. You know what I mean? And so we can make a determination if a war is just or not. Is it okay for Christians to support a certain war? Is it okay for Christians to participate in these wars? And that's the beauty of Christianity, that it can tackle these hard, difficult questions. You know what I mean? And it can be other issues. Whether it's the issue, I know you had Mr. Donovan on and he talked about the pro-life movement. Why is it wrong to take the life of an unborn child? Because we're made in the image of God. Life has value, worth, and dignity. And that image of God principle is a powerful principle. It explains why slavery is wrong. It explains why Jim Crow is wrong. It explains why segregation is wrong, right? It explains why abortion is wrong. So whatever issue we're looking at, Christianity has a framework, gives us the ability to analyze what we're seeing, and it gives us a foundation to draw a moral conclusion. And whether it's atheism, whether it's Marxism, these other worldviews, what ends up happening is they have to hijack Christianity's ethical system. Right. So if I'm a Marxist and everything is a class struggle between the haves and have-nots, well, exactly, using a Marxist system, why is it wrong for the haves to oppress the have-nots? Why is that actually wrong according to a Darwinist Marxist worldview? If it's just survival of the fittest, shouldn't the strong be encouraged to prey upon the weak to ensure the survival of the human race? So for even Karl Marx to make the claim that the haves preying on the have-nots is wrong, he has to borrow from Christianity's ethical system to make that moral claim. But because like they don't see that they're borrowing from a Christian ethical system, they don't see like the contradictions, that they don't see the mistake that they're making. And I think that that's the nature of how the enemy works, right? Satan seeks to cloud our minds. Our minds have been impacted by the fall, right? We are morally separated from God. Our sin separates us from God. Our flesh is corrupted, but our mind is also corrupted.
Oh, yeah.
That's why the only absolute source of truth it has to be the word of God, right? Our absolute source of truth cannot be found in Marxism. It can't be found in Darwinism. It can't be found in the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, right? Our source of truth has to be found in our identity in Christ, based on the word of God that is infallible and inerrant. Anything else is going to cause us to live a contradiction in our life. A foundation is built on sand. If we try to base our worldview on anything else, it's going to fall short. And over and over and over again, we're going to have to keep hijacking Christianity's worldview and ethical system. And if I have to keep borrowing Christianity's ethical system for my worldview to make sense, I need to come to the realization that maybe my worldview is insufficient, that it's incapable of fully explaining our daily experience as human beings.
Yeah.
So that's just a quick analysis. You know, like whatever event is taking place in the world today, Christianity offers a framework that allows us to explain what we're seeing and what we're experiencing, and ultimately allows us to use a moral evaluation to call something evil if it's evil, and to call something good if it's good.
Yeah. Well, and you know what's crazy is we talk about this in biology and environmental science. We talk about Darwinian evolution, and I really have to walk kids through the whole idea that the word evolution is not a cuss word. Like, things evolve, things change. But
Yes.
defining the terms, macroevolution versus microevolution.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that we are in a culture right now where so many people are almost fearful of even sharing their opinion or their perspective, because either it's going to be deemed as hate speech, or they're going to be canceled, which to me is so much more dangerous. I think it was interesting that you were starting to talk about Karl Marx, and I actually right next to me have a copy of 1984 Animal Farm and the Communist Manifesto, which I bought last year because I wanted to make sure I had copies before they went out of print. So, and in addition to some other books, but I do think I think that's something like I'm not familiar with the, did you call it the Christian just war list? Is that what you called it?
Yeah, the Christian just war theory.
Oh, theory. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that's something I don't really have. I mean, I don't have a lot of background in. That's something that I, honestly, I don't know how much time you want to elaborate, but I was wondering if maybe you could share a little bit about what that means, because when you said that, I was like, well, I really don't know what he's talking about. So.
Yeah, I didn't know about it much at all either until I started teaching my military history class, and I'm looking for, well, what does our Christian worldview say about war? So I started doing some digging, and basically the Christian just war theory goes back to Augustine. Then Ambrose of Milan built on it, and then into the Reformation, Martin Luther, but mainly John Calvin. And it goes to the modern era, but it's a long tradition of Christian intellectuals, Christian thinkers trying to answer the question: is a war ever justified or not? And is it okay for Christians to participate in conflict? And so the gist of it is there's 4 requirements that have to be met for a war to be just, right? And it's very simple. The first is the right to authority. Only the government has the authority to wage war. And before I continue, a lot of this is based in Romans 13. And so the government has, if you look at Romans 13, the Apostle Paul talks about how the government wields the instrument of the sword, right? So the sword it only has one purpose. It's not used for farming. It's not used for building, right? The sword only has one function. It is a weapon of war. It is a weapon of punishment. And so when the Apostle Paul says that the government wields the sword, that is conveying that the government has the authority to fight evil and protect its citizens, right? It says, if you do good, the Apostle Paul says, if you do good, there's nothing for you to be afraid of. But if you do evil, he says, be afraid, right? that the government doesn't wield the sword in vain, that the government is God's avenger of wrath. And what an act of mercy by God, that in this moment, in our fallen state, there is still a dim form of justice, right? That we don't have to wait. Once we get to eternity, all will be made right. But even in our current fallen condition, justice is possible, even in a maybe a faded form compared to the eternal form, right? That there is the possibility of fighting evil, defending against injustice in this world, and the government is the institution for that, right? So that's step one. Only the government can wage war, right? Authority, right? Individuals can't, right? My second period can't declare war on third period, right? Like it's like, Virginia can't fight Georgia, okay, like it's only.
We're already fighting Alabama, Dan. So
Gotcha.
yeah. If you're talking about the University of Georgia, they just hate everybody. So anyways,
Gotcha.
I digress.
Yeah. So anyways, right authority is the first one. Second one is you have right authority. The second one is right cause, that a war, in order for Christians to participate in a war, has to be fought for the right cause. And so what is the right cause? It's war out of self-defense. Right, so no wars of aggression, no wars of resources. For resources, it is a war fought out of self-defense. So if you think about like 9/11, if you think about Pearl Harbor, these would be examples of just wars, of wars that are checking that box, right cause, right, fighting a war out of self-defense. The third one is right proportion. That when we go to war, we need to use the appropriate amount of military force in order to minimize death and destruction, okay? So if you think about the two wars that the United States had to withdraw from in failure, if you think about Vietnam and Afghanistan, the United States possessed nuclear weapons during those two conflicts. Yet, the United States did not use them to achieve its victory. So the United States would rather lose a war than violate that principle of right proportion, right? That we would rather lose a war than win it, but in the process, millions died. Right. So it's interesting how American foreign policy, though they don't call it the Christian just war theory, you see echoes of the Christian just war theory in the framework of our foreign policy. And it goes to show the heavy influence that the Christian worldview had on our founding fathers when they're creating the Constitution and the framework for our country, that the Christian principles that I've just been describing to you are the principles that we follow in conflict. So we would rather lose a war than kill millions and be victorious. And what worldview best explains that, right? If it's just survival of the fittest, like if you think of the United States embracing atheism, if we follow survival of the fittest, then countries should not restrain themselves. Like they should try to achieve the ultimate victory. And if millions die, well, they're the less fit. We need to ensure that the survival of the human race. So there is no like restraining one's military force in the pursuit of total victory. Yet if we did that, if we nuked Vietnam, if we nuked Afghanistan, rightfully so, there would be moral outrage. That millions of men, women, and children are dying in the pursuit of this victory. We've lost the moral high ground, and correctly, the American people would turn against that war and would call for it to end immediately. So why is that? You know what I mean? What worldview best explains that moral reaction to that? So right proportion is using the appropriate amount of military force in the engagement that you're involved in. And the fourth and final one is right action. So we only target military targets. We don't, those that surrender, their combat status changes. They might have been shooting at you seconds ago, but as soon as they throw down the weapon and their hands go up, their combat status changes, and all these international treaties and laws now protect that individual. So we don't target civilians, we don't target POWs, we only target military targets. So if those four boxes, right authority, right cause, right proportion, and right action, if those four boxes are being checked, then we can say that that war is a just war, and Christians can not only support the war vocally, but they can participate in it. But the hard part is if those qualifications are not being met, then Christians have a responsibility and obligation to call out the injustice of that conflict And even if it comes across as unpatriotic or possibly disloyal, we are responsible to be the conscience of our communities, the conscience of our country, and we have to call attention to that injustice, no matter how unpopular it might make us.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I have, over my teaching career, I get I get tired of seeing Christians just kind of back down from engaging in discussions, especially when it comes to holding leaders accountable. They say, well, Christians shouldn't get involved in politics and Christians shouldn't get involved in this. And I'm like, well, it's interesting that you say that, because if you go even back to Jesus' day, Jesus went into the temple, turns the tables over, for the money changers and calls them vipers and hypocrites. And, the Son of God had no heart. He didn't have a difficulty going in and calling people out whenever they were doing what was against what God had called those people to do. And when we elect someone, whether it be president or, whatever government official at whatever level, I think it's extremely important that, as you mentioned, that Christians do have that attitude of, holding people accountable, but also doing it in a way that would represent Jesus Christ. And maybe that's the reason some people don't want to engage. Maybe we have a saying in South Georgia. It's my South Georgia's about to come out. I'm about to go crazy. And of course, there's a lot of other sayings I guess we could throw in there that would not be as Christ-like, but. But I do think it's fascinating that, I've never heard of those 4 check boxes, and every single one of them, as you mentioned, every single one of them are just so practical in the fact that God is no respecter of persons. That there is no one that is before God that's not as equally as sinful as the other when it comes to whether we accept Christ or whether we don't. So I'll be honest with you, I really appreciate you sharing that. That was almost like a revelation there. So, but speaking of that, kind of transitioning, are there particular resources or, like even whether it be, obviously the Word of God is our sole authority. That is what is the only inerrant script, is the only inerrant work that has persevered for thousands of years of persecution over various continents. But are there other resources or websites or commentaries maybe that you feel like have helped you, or that you would suggest people check out, or anything that, just for some additional reading and additional information?
Yeah, so I would recommend Nancy Pearcey's book, Total Truth. Okay. And that is the book that sent me down this path of evaluating, what am I doing as a history teacher? If you took me from Liberty Christian Academy and put me in a public school, would there be any difference in my teaching? I early on in my teaching career, I realized that my Christian faith had no influence whatsoever in what I was teaching my students. That I had fallen into that trap where, well, this is history and I need to separate it from my Christian worldview. And there was no difference between me and someone who was not saved. Mm-hmm. So I started reading Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey, and that's what sent me and my department down this path to completely revise our history standards. We read 10 pages a week for our Friday meeting for about 2 years. So we read that book together as a history department, and it led us to completely changing the way that we teach the subject of history. We developed new standards. We created 4 creation principles that form the bedrock of all of our content and curriculum, right? The sovereignty of God principle. God is in control and command of all things. He's the author and creator of all things. History has a purpose. It's not an endless cycle. Creation principle number 2 is the image of God principle, that because we're made in the image of God, all life has value, worth, and dignity. And then creation principle number 3 is the creation mandates, that we are created to harness the earth's resources, to be good stewards of what God has given us, to build civilizations, to have families, to create laws and establish governments, right? So that is the creation mandate, creation principle number 3. And then finally, creation principle number 4 is the order and justice principle. And that is there's a divine moral standard that exists that applies to all people in all times. And that's where we can have just laws and just government. That's where our Christian just war theory fits in. So our students learn about the Christian just war theory there in creation principle number 4. So those 4 principles, they came out of resources like Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey. And if someone is an educator, a Christian educator, and wanting to deepen their knowledge and understanding of how their Christian worldview should impact their teaching, I think another good starting point is an article that's free. You can Google it. It's an article written by Dr. Brian Smith, and it's called Biblical Integration, Pitfalls and Promise. And it's just a couple of pages long, and it's a good overview of what biblical integration is, what it looks like, what it's not. And so if someone's just starting down the path, who's an educator, and even not an educator, someone who's a parent, who's trying to communicate deep Christian truths to their kids and trying to fight against the lies of Satan, trying to separate our Christian faith from our daily life, it's a powerful tool for parents to read. And so that would be another good starting point. And then specifically for history, another book that our department read was a book called History, A Student's Guide by Nathan Finn. And it's part of a book series called Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition. And so they have books like this for science, for literature, for art, music, for government, for history. So we read the history book for that series. And it was another one of those books that was really challenging. Am I basing what I'm teaching off of a Christian worldview, or is it coming from somewhere else? And so those are 3 that I think of that would be really helpful resources.
That's awesome. Once you start listing off books, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble because I'm going to Amazon and I'm going to start buying these books, and I'm already in trouble for buying too much. So,
yeah.
But I do think even from a science perspective, there's a lot of books on this shelf behind me and even on the floor. I try to encourage students as much as I can to get their hands on a physical resource, to not always rely on electronic media. And I've mentioned it in several other podcasts, is just making sure you've got something on hand so that if one day you wake up and you have no power in your house, that you're not relying on a Wi-Fi signal, that you can pull out a book. And, so I think it's extremely important. There was one thing I wanted to ask you before we, kind of transition out. I know that you do world history too, and you're not really I'm assuming you don't have a huge government or civics and economics, those are individual courses. Do you ever tackle the issue of climate change? Does that ever come up in your class discussions? Do y'all ever anything like that?
In our final section of the year of our notes, we talk about some of the challenges that the world's facing. And so we take some of those issues. It's not in depth. It's a brief overview. So we mentioned that's a debate, a discussion that's ongoing. We talk briefly about critical theory. We try to identify some of the topics and worldviews and ideas that are shaping our culture so that our students are ready to engage in those conversations. And so it's a high school level, type approach to it. It's not going to be like a college level depth to it. But to answer your question, we briefly touch upon it, but it probably doesn't go into the depth that it should.
Okay. I was just curious. That was just kind of a little, squirrel moment. So, as far as, I know you've kind of given an idea of some different resources that you thought would be helpful. Any last encouragements for somebody who might, sincerely, whether they're an educator, a parent, a student, or just a general observer, maybe somebody that's listening who maybe is not a Christian, maybe some encouragements just from understanding or contemplating things from a biblical perspective?
Yeah, I think we're called to participate in the most powerful story of all. And there is a lot of pain, evil, and suffering in this world, but God's plan of redemption provides hope for that. Mm-hmm. And Edmund Burke, a political thinker, once said that all that is necessary for evil to win is for good men and women to do nothing. Mm-hmm. And so I think the challenge of the gospel is those that are redeemed, what are we doing with our faith, right? John Stonestreet put it this way. He says, we know what we're saved from. We're saved from sin, right? We're saved from the wrath of God. What are we saved for? Like, what is our salvation for? And so he said the answer to that involves a lot of words that start with the letters R-E, that we are called to be redeemers. We are to reconcile and restore. And so there is a need in this world for believers to be that redemption to a lost world, to be a light in a dark world. I call it being a Romans 12:2 Christian, that we're not conforming to the fallen culture of our time. Instead, we're transformed by the truth of God's word. So as we see the evil and suffering, we run towards the sounds of evil and suffering and chaos, right? I think of like the Twin Towers and 9/11, watching it on live TV, seeing the smoke billowing from the skyscrapers, that gaping hole that was left from the impact of the plane. And if you watch the video clips and the video footage, you see thousands of people running away from the Twin Towers. But if you look closely, you also see people running in. You see firefighters and police officers and first responders. When everyone else is running away, they're running into the chaos. And that is a picture of what we are called to do as believers, that we are to run towards the sounds of chaos, to evil and suffering, to participate in God's plan of redemption. And there's nothing more fulfilling and powerful than a life spent lived for others. So there is no other worldview, there is no other story that has that type of powerful call for individuals to die to our selfish nature every single day out of love for God and love for others. And so I think that that's a powerful story that all of us would want to be part of.
Yeah, well, and I'm telling you, I got chills when you started talking about that. I mean, it's just, I was a sophomore in college whenever 9/11 hit, and I can remember that day so plainly. I remember really starting to get concerned about the situation of the world, because that literally was, that was home that was being struck, even though it was further north. And I remember sitting in the medical center. I had a strep throat, and I was sitting there watching on the TV, and just the anger welling up as you see the American flag being burned in other countries, and you're just sitting here going, what is going on? And then they switch to these videos where, like you mentioned, people are running in, and people are just covered in ash and debris, and all these people are missing. And you think, wow, those people actually did that for people they had no clue who was inside of there. And so that's why, again, I really believe events like that have transformed my way of thinking, that even if those people were non-believers, like you mentioned, it is a very much a Christian principle that no person be left behind, and that we do try to reach the world with the gospel. And it obviously comes in one form through Jesus Christ, but it can be represented in any profession, any job, and any person that is exposed to that can definitely be saved. So I don't know if you're on social media, if there's things as far as if someone had other questions or wanted to ask you something. I didn't know if there might be a way people could get in touch with you.
Yeah, I think I have a Facebook page. I think still I haven't checked it in a number of years. So I'm on Twitter, but I've never posted a single tweet. I just follow different news organizations and stuff. So that's a tough one. Maybe I can give you my email address. That's how old school I am. Right?
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
If people need to reach out, I can give you my contact info.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Well, I'll tell you what a lot of people do is, people will message me on our Facebook. We've got the Creation and Compost page.
Okay.
But then they'll email us and they'll ask questions and say, hey, that person that was on there, like what, and of course, I'm never going to give anybody's private or personal information, of course, without their say. But, I know that this is a subject that someone recently, it's so funny that we had this scheduled. And then just yesterday, I checked my email, and some of the subjects that you hit on, this one individual was requesting some of this. So you can already see that, again, God's plan, even if it's that one person who hears it and that one person is changed or is influenced in a positive way. I mean, that's why we're doing this,
Yeah,
so.
Matt, if I can add real quick, if there's someone that is an educator, someone that is homeschooling their kids, I would be happy to share the biblical integration structure that we've created here absolutely for free. Like this is the resources that our department has created, from the creation principles to the assignments that we use. I would be happy to share that with anybody that would need it.
Well, that is amazingly selfless of you, Dan, and that's part of what I love about this is the people that are coming on these podcast sessions have just such a heart, not for any kind of monetary gain, but seeing souls change, seeing souls saved. And that is extremely nice of you. So for anybody who watches this, anybody who listens, or if you view it on YouTube, if you have questions about the curriculum tools that Dan was talking about, you can email us at bracewell2007@creationandcompost.com, or you can message us on Facebook or Instagram. We will definitely get back with you. And Dan, let me just say, I'd love to talk to you for 5 more hours, but I know that we both have things we have to get to. So, brother, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you do on a daily basis. And I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I really appreciate you coming on with us today.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. It's been a privilege.